Long before Iran became a nuclear threat, it was already named in the scrolls of eternity. What if I told you that a prophet, writing from exile over 2,500 years ago, didn't just see the fall of Jerusalem, but the spiritual architecture behind today's headlines? What if the name Iran was never just political, but prophetic? You've watched the news, you've felt the trembling, Israel surrounded, Iran threatening annihilation, missiles in the night, nuclear ambitions wrapped in apocalyptic rhetoric. But what if this isn't chaos? What if this is a blueprint? The prophet Ezekiel, sitting beside the muddy waters of Babylon, his temple destroyed, his people scattered like dust in the wind, received a vision so precise, so terrifying, that scholars still whisper about it in hushed tones. He saw armies from the north. He saw ancient Persia, modern Iran marching in coalition. He saw fire falling from heaven. He saw a war that would make the nations tremble. And he saw the hand of God rise to end it. Hidden in plain sight, carved into the sacred text, lies a roadmap that connects the throne rooms of ancient Persia to the bunkers of modern Tehran. From Cyrus the Great to the Ayatollahs, from Daniel's visions to today's diplomatic cables. But here's what shakes me to my core. If Ezekiel's ancient words are unfolding in real time, if we're not just watching geopolitics but witnessing prophecy breathe again, then what does that mean for you, for your children, for the generation that may see these scrolls completely fulfilled? Before we go deeper into this mystery, I want to thank every single one of you who has supported this message through Super Thanks. Your generosity means more than you know. You're not just donating, you're helping spread light to others who feel alone in their calling, who hunger for truth in an age of confusion. Whether you give or not, I'm deeply grateful for your presence here. Your time, your heart. It all matters. And if this message resonates with your soul, then stay with me, because what you're about to discover will change how you read every headline, every threat, every tremor in the Middle East. The real question isn't whether Ezekiel's prophecy will be fulfilled. The question is, are you spiritually prepared for what happens when it is? Because the prophet didn't just see war coming. He saw what comes after. And that changes everything. Before Cyrus ever breathed, heaven had already spoken his name. But to understand how a pagan king would one day be called God's anointed, we must journey back. Back beyond empires and armies, beyond thrones and temples, to a moment when the earth was still wet from judgment, and three sons stood on the deck of an ark, carrying in their bloodlines the entire future of nations. The floodwaters had receded, the dove had returned with an olive branch, and Noah, righteous Noah, looked upon his three sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, spoke over them words that would echo through millennia. These weren't just blessings, they were prophetic blueprints, divine assignments written into DNA, destinies carved into the very chromosomes of humanity's second beginning. From Japheth came a name that most skip over in their hurried reading of Genesis 10, Madai, just 7 letters in the Hebrew. But those 7 letters would father the Medes, the mountain warriors who would one day shake the world. And from Shem's lineage emerged another forgotten footnote, Elam, the father of the Elamites, whose descendants would build cities in the fertile plains that we now call southwestern Iran. 2 brothers of different fathers, 2 bloodlines from different tribes, but both destined to converge in a land that would become the epicenter of empire, the birthplace of kings, and the staging ground for the final war between heaven and earth. You see, Iran didn't just happen. Persia wasn't an accident of geography or politics. From the very foundation of the post-flood world, God was positioning pieces on a chessboard that stretched across time itself. Madai and Elam weren't just tribal patriarchs settling new territory. They were arrows shot into the future, carrying within their seed the genetic memory of both rebellion and redemption. And it didn't take long for that rebellion to surface. Genesis 14 records what biblical scholars call the First World War. 4 eastern kings, including Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, formed an alliance and swept westward like a plague of locusts. They plundered cities, enslaved populations, and among their captives, they took someone precious. They took Lot, the nephew of Abraham, the man walking in covenant with the Most High. Can you feel the spiritual weight of that moment? This wasn't just military strategy. This was the first recorded confrontation between the seed of promise and the powers of the East. The descendants of Elam ancient Iran had dared to touch what God had blessed. They had laid hands on the family line through which the Messiah would one day come. But Abraham didn't negotiate. He didn't send diplomats or offer tribute. With 318 trained men from his own household, he launched a nighttime assault that shattered the Eastern coalition and rescued Lot from their grip. It was David and Goliath, played out centuries before David was born. It was a handful of covenant warriors defeating an empire. Yet here's what haunts me about that ancient battle. God could have simply spoken, and the Eastern kings would have crumbled into dust. He could have sent angels, plagues, or fire from heaven. Instead, he chose to use Abraham's faith and a small band of servants to accomplish his will. Why? Because he was establishing a pattern that would echo through the ages, a pattern where the seemingly impossible becomes inevitable when heaven and earth align in covenant. The victory at the Valley of the Kings wasn't just about rescuing Lot. It was a declaration written in blood and fire across the ancient world. No Eastern power, no matter how vast or organized, could succeed against the one who walks in covenant with the Almighty. It was a warning shot fired across the bow of history, a spiritual precedent that would reverberate through every future conflict between East and West, between Persia and Israel, between the children of promise and the children of pride. But here's the mystery that still leaves theologians trembling. God didn't destroy Elam that day. He defeated them, yes. He humbled them, absolutely. But he preserved them. He allowed the bloodline to continue, the nation to endure, the seed to multiply across the centuries. Why would the God of justice spare those who had threatened his covenant? Why would he allow their descendants to flourish in the very land that would one day birth the Persian Empire? Because the same God who sees the end from the beginning knew something that wouldn't be revealed for another 1,500 years. He knew that the descendants of Elam, the children of Madai, would one day be transformed from enemies into instruments. He knew that a pagan king named Cyrus would arise from their loins, and that this king, this unlikely, unknowing, unworthy king, would become the hand of God himself, opening prison doors, funding temple reconstruction, and fulfilling prophecies that had been spoken before Persia was even a name on any map. The defeat of Elam in Genesis 14 wasn't their end. It was their beginning. It was God's way of saying, I will break your pride, but I will not break my purpose for you. I will humble your rebellion, but I will not abandon my plan through you. Could a name buried in Genesis carry the key to the final war? Could two forgotten footnotes in the Table of Nations hold the secret to understanding why Iran dominates today's headlines? Could the bloodlines of Madai and Elam still be flowing through the veins of modern Tehran, carrying within them an ancient appointment with destiny that most of the world can't see? The dust of the earth became Adam. The dust of Babylon became an empire. But the dust of Persia carries within it the memory of covenant warfare and the promise of divine purpose. But even the ones who rise against the promise may one day become the vessel for it. What if I told you that the most powerful prophecy about Iran wasn't written by a Persian mystic or Islamic scholar, but by a Hebrew prophet who had never set foot in Persia? What if the destiny of modern Iran was sealed not in the halls of Tehran, but in the scrolls of ancient Israel? His name was Cyrus. History remembers him as Cyrus the Great, founder of the Persian Empire, conqueror of nations, liberator of peoples. But heaven knew him by a different title long before he drew his first breath. The God of Abraham called him my anointed. The same word Mashiach reserved for the kings and priests of Israel was placed upon the head of a pagan ruler who would never bow in the temple, never offer a sacrifice at the altar, never even know the name of the one who crowned him. The year was 701 BC, when the prophet Isaiah received a vision so stunning, so impossible, that it would echo through the corridors of time for over a century. In the darkness of his prophetic chamber, Isaiah heard the voice of the Almighty speak a name that didn't yet exist. Thus says the Lord to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have grasped to subdue nations before him. Think about that. 150 years before Cyrus was born, before the Persian Empire was even a whisper in the wind, before Babylon had fallen or the Jews had been exiled, God was already writing the script of redemption with a foreign pen. The prophet spoke the name of a king whose great-grandfather had not yet been conceived, whose empire had not yet been imagined, whose very people were still scattered tribes in the mountains of what would become Iran. But heaven's timeline doesn't bow to earth's confusion. What man calls impossible, God calls inevitable. When Cyrus finally stepped onto the stage of history in 559 BC, he rose like a storm from the east. Nation after nation fell before his armies, not through cruelty, but through a revolutionary concept: mercy. Unlike the brutal conquests of Assyria and Babylon, Cyrus conquered through liberation. He freed enslaved peoples, restored their temples, returned their gods. His cylinder, discovered by archaeologists, reads like a charter of human rights written 25 centuries before the term was invented. But there was one conquest that would define not just his legacy, but the very heartbeat of prophecy itself: Babylon. The Golden Empire that had burned Jerusalem, shattered the temple, and dragged God's people into 70 years of exile. Babylon, whose king Nebuchadnezzar had dared to throw Hebrew children into furnaces and declare himself a god. Babylon, whose very name had become synonymous with the arrogance that dares to challenge heaven. On the 12th of October, 539 BC, the impossible happened. Cyrus entered Babylon without a battle. The gates opened, as if by invisible hands. The mighty empire that had terrorized the world for generations simply surrendered. And in that moment, the prophet Daniel, now an old man who had served in Babylonian courts for 70 years, must have felt his heart tremble, because he knew what this meant. He had read Isaiah's scrolls. He had calculated Jeremiah's prophecy. The 70 years were complete. What followed was not what you'd expect from a conquering king. Cyrus didn't burn the libraries or melt down the gold. Instead, he issued a decree that would shake heaven and earth. The Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has appointed me to build him a house at Jerusalem. A pagan king acknowledging the God of Israel, a foreign ruler funding the temple's reconstruction, a Persian emperor becoming the unlikely shepherd of Jewish restoration. This wasn't politics, this was prophecy walking off the page and into history. But here's the mystery that pierces the soul. Cyrus didn't know he was fulfilling prophecy. Isaiah 45:4 captures the stunning irony. For the sake of Jacob my servant, and Israel, my chosen, I call you by your name. I surname you, though you have not known me. God used him completely. Cyrus used God unconsciously. The same hand that moved Pharaoh's heart to let Israel go was now moving a Persian king's heart to let Israel return. The same sovereignty that drowned Egyptian chariots in the Red Sea was now drowning Babylonian pride in the rivers of Persia. Can you feel the weight of this truth? The God who scattered Israel in judgment was the same God who gathered them in mercy. And the instrument of their return wasn't a Hebrew prophet or a Davidic king, it was a foreign ruler who worshipped foreign gods but somehow found himself writing checks to rebuild the house of Yahweh. This is the scandal of sovereignty. God doesn't need our permission to use us. He doesn't require our theology to be perfect or our worship to be pure. He can turn the heart of a king like a river, redirect the plans of an empire like a gentle wind, and use the enemies of his people to become their unexpected saviors. Over 42,000 Jewish exiles returned to Jerusalem under Cyrus's decree. They carried with them not just their possessions, but the sacred vessels that Nebuchadnezzar had stolen from Solomon's temple. Gold and silver cups that had been gathering dust in Babylonian storehouses were now being polished for worship in a rebuilt sanctuary. The treasures that symbolized Israel's defeat were becoming the tools of their restoration. And Cyrus paid for it all. Persian gold rebuilt Jewish walls. Persian timber framed Jewish worship. Persian authority protected Jewish workers. A pagan empire became the unlikely midwife of Israel's rebirth. But here's what haunts me. If God could use ancient Persia as an instrument of mercy, what is he doing with modern Iran? If he could move the heart of Cyrus to bless Israel, what stirring might he be preparing in Tehran? If he could turn Babylon's destroyer into Jerusalem's rebuilder, what impossible redemption might he be writing even now? Don't misunderstand, this isn't naive optimism about current Iranian leadership. This is faith in an unchanging God who specializes in impossible turnarounds. The same Lord who called Cyrus my anointed before he was born is still moving in the hearts of kings, still writing scripts of redemption in the most unlikely places. Because Cyrus was more than a historical curiosity. He was a preview, a glimpse of how God will ultimately use all Nation 7 hostile ones to fulfill his purposes. And if Persia could once be the hand of divine mercy, then perhaps Perhaps the story of Iran and Israel isn't finished being written. But Persia's hands, once open in blessing, would not remain clean forever. She wore no sword, only silence and favor, yet kingdoms trembled at her yes. In the glittering courts of Susa, where marble pillars stretched toward heaven and golden vessels caught the light of 1,000 oil lamps, the most powerful empire on earth was about to be turned by the voice of an orphaned girl. Her name was Esther, but the palace knew her only as queen. They did not know she carried the blood of Abraham. They did not know she prayed to the God of Israel. They did not know that heaven had placed her there not for beauty, but for battle. What if I told you that the same empire Ezekiel would later name in his visions of where ancient Persia, modern Iran, was once the stage for one of the most stunning reversals in biblical history? What if the nation that today threatens Israel's destruction was once the very throne room where Israel's preservation was decreed? This is the mystery hidden in the book of Esther, a mystery that whispers across 25 centuries, echoing from the courts of Xerxes to the corridors of Tehran. Because before Persia became Israel's enemy, it was her unlikely sanctuary. And the woman who saved the Jewish people did it not with armies or alliances, but with 3 days of fasting and the courage to walk uninvited into the presence of absolute power. Picture it. King Ahasuerus, as known to history as Xerxes the Great, sits on a throne that commands from India to Ethiopia. 127 provinces bow to his word. His empire spans continents. His wealth defies counting. And in his harem, among hundreds of the most beautiful women in the known world, lives a Jewish girl who has hidden her identity so completely that not even her closest servants suspect the truth. Mordecai, her cousin and guardian, paces the palace gates daily, not as a courtier, but as a watchman, because he knows something the empire does not. That the girl behind the crown carries more than royal blood. She carries the future of the covenant in her hands. Then comes Haman, descendant of Agag, heir to an ancient hatred that stretches back to the wilderness wanderings of Israel. When Mordecai refuses to bow not from arrogance, but from conscience, Haman's pride erupts into something far more sinister than personal revenge. He will not merely destroy one man, he will erase an entire people. The decree goes out across the empire, sealed with the king's ring, written in the law of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be altered. On the 13th day of the 12th month, every Jew in the empire, man, woman, child, will be slaughtered. Do you see the pattern? Do you see how the enemy always overreaches? How genocide becomes the devil's signature move? From Pharaoh's order to kill Hebrew infants, to Herod's massacre in Bethlehem, to Hitler's ovens, to modern calls for Israel to be wiped off the map, the spirit behind the hatred never changes. Only the uniforms are different. But watch what God does. He doesn't send an army. He doesn't split the sea. He doesn't rain fire from heaven. Instead, he whispers to a woman hidden in plain sight. Mordecai's message reaches Esther through palace corridors. Who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this? Such a time as this. 4 words that have haunted history ever since, because they remind us that our positioning is never accidental, that our placement may be providential, that what looks like coincidence to us may be choreography to him. Esther faces a choice that would crush most souls. To remain silent is to watch her people die. To speak is to risk everything. Her position, her comfort, her very life. Persian law is clear. Approach the king uninvited and die, unless he extends his golden scepter in mercy. She has not been summoned for 30 days. She could easily remain hidden, safe behind her carefully constructed identity. But instead, she chooses something that moves heaven itself. 3 days of fasting, not just skipping meals, but entering into the kind of spiritual warfare that bends the will of empires. She calls the Jews of Susa to join her. And in that moment, the hidden queen becomes something more powerful than royalty. She becomes an intercessor. Can you see it? Can you see how Esther's walk into that throne room prefigures another walk to another throne? How her willingness to die for her people points forward to one who would actually die for his? How her 3 days of darkness before deliverance whispers of 3 days in a tomb before resurrection? This is not just ancient history. This is prophetic theater. Esther's intercession in Persia becomes a dress rehearsal for Christ's intercession at the cross. When she finally approaches the king, something extraordinary happens. The scepter extends, favor flows, and instead of demanding immediate justice, Esther displays the kind of wisdom that only comes from above. She invites the king and Haman to a banquet, Then, another banquet. She waits. She watches. She lets divine timing ripen like fruit ready for harvest. And at that second feast, when wine has loosened tongues and guard has been lowered, the hidden truth explodes into the light. If I have found favor in your sight, O King, let my life be given me at my petition, and my people at my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. The king's rage is immediate. Who would dare touch his queen? Who would dare threaten her people? And Esther's finger points across the table. A foe and enemy. This wicked Haman. The reversal is swift and complete. The gallows Haman built for Mordecai becomes his own execution platform. The decree that would have destroyed the Jews becomes the vehicle for their deliverance. A new edict goes out, not overriding the first, for Persian law cannot be changed but empowering the Jews to defend themselves. And when that day of intended slaughter arrives, it becomes instead a day of victory so complete that many throughout the empire convert to Judaism out of sheer terror and awe at what they have witnessed. But here's what we must not miss. This deliverance happened in Persia, in the very empire that Ezekiel would later name as part of the coalition against Israel. The same soil that today breeds hatred toward the Jewish state once witnessed their miraculous preservation. The same throne that would later oppose God's covenant once extended its scepter to save it. What does this tell us? That God's mercy is deeper than our understanding, that his strategies span centuries, that even empires destined for judgment can become temporary vessels of grace, that no nation is too far gone for a divine reversal, and that sometimes the very place you expect destruction from becomes the place your deliverance flows through. The spirit of Haman did not die on those gallows in Susa. It migrated. It found new hosts, new uniforms, new flags. But the same ancient hatred that once whispered genocide in Persian courts now echoes in the halls of Tehran. Yet Esther's victory reminds us that even there, even now, God can raise up voices of deliverance from the most unlikely places. What if your silence is the one thing delaying someone else's deliverance? What if you, like Esther, have been positioned for such a time as this? What if the very place you feel most hidden is where God intends to reveal his greatest glory? The gallows meant for God's people would become the platform of his justice. But this was only the beginning of Persia's dance with destiny, because ahead lay centuries more of divine orchestration and a final appointment that would echo from ancient scrolls to modern headlines, from Ezekiel's visions to tomorrow's news. Daniel fasted by a river and the heavens began to shake. Picture this: an old man, weathered by decades of exile, kneeling beside the muddy waters of the Tigris, his face gaunt from 3 weeks without choice food, his spirit heavy with visions he could barely comprehend. The Babylonian Empire had fallen. Persia now ruled the world. And Daniel, servant of the Most High, had been praying for his people, when suddenly the sky tore open. What appeared before him was not flesh and blood, but fire clothed in linen, a being whose voice thundered like the sound of a multitude, whose eyes blazed like torches, whose face shone like lightning itself. And this messenger from the throne room of eternity brought Daniel a revelation that would shatter everything we think we know about earthly power. The prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me 21 days. Do you hear what just happened? An Angela warrior of heaven had been locked in spiritual combat for 3 weeks. Not with Cyrus, not with Persian armies, not with flesh and blood, but with the prince of Persia, a demonic principality so powerful, so entrenched, so ancient, that it could delay the very messengers of God. This wasn't politics. This was spiritual warfare in its rawest form. Behind every earthly throne sits an unseen power. Behind every empire's rise and fall moves a cosmic chess game between light and darkness. And Persia, this empire that once freed the Jews, that once rebuilt Jerusalem's temple, was simultaneously the staging ground for hell's resistance against heaven's purposes. Think about that. The very nation God used to deliver his people was also the battleground where demons fought to prevent that deliverance. The same Persian king who signed the decree to rebuild the temple was unknowingly the center of a war that raged in realms he could never see. Daniel's 3 weeks of fasting weren't just spiritual discipline. They were intercession that literally moved the heavens. Every time he fell to his knees, every time he cried out for his people, every time he refused food and sought the face of God, he was joining a battle that determined the fate of nations. But here's what chills me to the bone. the angel tells Daniel something even more terrifying. Now, I will return to fight with the prince of Persia, and when I go forth, indeed, the prince of Greece will come. The battle wasn't ending, it was just beginning. One demonic prince would fall, only for another to rise. Empire after empire, each one powered not just by human ambition, but by spiritual rebellion that has never surrendered, never died, never given up its claim to the thrones of earth. Can you see it now? When Alexander the Great swept across Persia like wildfire, conquering the known world in less than a decade, that wasn't just military genius. That was the Prince of Greece ascending to power as the Prince of Persia fell. When Rome crushed Greece and built an empire that lasted 1,000 years, that was another principality claiming dominion. When that Roman Empire finally crumbled, the powers behind it didn't disappear. They simply relocated. And Iran today? The Islamic Republic that calls for Israel's destruction? That funds terror across the Middle East? That races toward nuclear capability while denying the Holocaust? What if I told you that the same spiritual prince that withstood Gabriel in Daniel's day is still sitting on that throne? What if the hatred you see in the streets of Tehran, the apocalyptic rhetoric echoing from the Ayatollahs, the obsession with destroying the Jewish state, what if all of that is just the latest chapter in a 2,500-year war between the Prince of Persia and the God of Abraham? Daniel saw something else in that vision by the river. He saw that behind every geopolitical crisis, behind every international alliance, behind every war and rumor of war, there is a spiritual dimension that most people never perceive. The kings think they're making decisions. The generals think they're moving armies. The diplomats think they're negotiating treaties. But above them all, principalities and powers are pulling strings, influencing hearts, and driving events toward an end that was written before time began. This is why Daniel's intercession mattered so much. This is why his fasting literally delayed heaven's messenger. Because prayer is not just talking to goat, it's joining the war that determines which spirits rule over which nations. When you kneel before the throne of grace, you're not just asking for personal blessings. You're stepping onto a battlefield where angels and demons clash over the destiny of kingdoms. And here's the question that should shake you. If Daniel's 3 weeks of prayer could influence the cosmic battle over Persia, if his intercession could determine whether God's purposes would be fulfilled or frustrated, then what kind of power rests in your prayers today? Are you praying like heaven moves when you kneel? Are you interceding like nations hang in the balance when you seek God's face? Are you fasting like your spiritual discipline could literally shift the principalities that rule over the Middle East? Because right now, as Iran threatens Israel with annihilation, as nuclear ambitions meet ancient hatred, as the sons of Ishmael rage against the sons of Isaac, there is a war raging in the heavenly places that makes Daniel's vision look like a preview of coming attractions. The angel told Daniel something else that night by the river. But I will tell you what is noted in the scripture of truth. There was a book, a scroll, a divine record that contained the end from the beginning, and everything Daniel saw: the rise of Persia, the fall of Greece, the coming of Rome, and yes, even the final battle between Gog and Magog. All of it was already written. The Prince of Persia fought so hard to stop Gabriel because he knew what was in that scroll. He knew that his time was limited. He knew that every empire he influenced, every king he corrupted, every war he instigated was just delaying the inevitable. He knew that one day the King of Kings would return, and every principality, every power, every throne, and every dominion would bow. But until that day comes, the battle rages. And the question for every believer, every intercessor, every person who dares to seek the face of God is this: will you join Daniel by the river? Will you fast and pray like the fate of nations depends on it? Will you stand in the gap between heaven and earth and cry out for God's will to be done? Because the Prince of Persia never died. He just changed faces, and the war that began in Daniel's day is still being fought in ours. The only question is, which side will you choose to fight on? He saw dry bones, and a nation that remembered how to breathe. Picture this: a valley so wide that the horizon disappears into death itself. Bones bleached white by centuries of silence. Ribs scattered like broken promises. Skulls that once carried dreams now empty as abandoned temples. This wasn't a graveyard, this was the cemetery of hope itself. And into this field of impossibility, God brought his prophet, "Son of man," the voice thundered across the wasteland. "Can these bones live?" Ezekiel, standing knee-deep in the graveyard of his people's future, could only whisper what every broken heart knows. "Oh, Lord God, you know." What happened next defied every law of nature, every principle of science, every assumption about death's finality. God commanded Ezekiel to do something that seemed insane. Prophesy to the bones, not to the living, not to the faithful, not to those who could hear and respond, to corpses, to dust, to the impossible. And as the prophet's voice rang out across that valley of death, something began to stir, a sound like distant thunder, like an earthquake beginning in the depths of the earth. The sound of bone calling to bone. Imagine the terror. Imagine the awe. Femurs rolling across the sand to find their partners. Vertebrae stacking themselves in perfect order, ribs expanding like the framework of a cathedral under construction. What had been scattered by centuries of exile was suddenly, miraculously, impossibly coming together. But they were still dead, bodies without breath, armies without life. The machinery of humanity assembled but not awakened, until God spoke again. Prophesy to the wind. Call the breath from the four corners of heaven. And breath entered them. Not just air, the Ruach, the very spirit of the Almighty. And they stood, not as survivors, but as an army, vast, ordered, alive. These bones, God told Ezekiel, are the whole house of Israel. For nearly 2,000 years, this prophecy seemed like poetry. Beautiful, but metaphorical. The Jewish people scattered to the ends of the earth. Poland, Russia, Yemen, Ethiopia, Morocco, different languages, different customs, different generations removed from their homeland. Many had never seen Jerusalem except in dreams passed down through centuries of exile. They were, by every human calculation, finished. But prophecy doesn't operate by human calculation. May 14th, 1948. The British Mandate expires at midnight. David Ben-Gurion stands before a small gathering in Tel Aviv and reads 16 words that shook the foundations of the earth. "We hereby declare the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine, to be known as the State of Israel." In a single day, exactly as Isaiah prophesied, a nation was born. But look deeper. Look with Ezekiel's eyes. The Jews who returned weren't just individuals making a political decision. They were bones, remembering their place in the skeleton of prophecy. Holocaust survivors who should have been ashes became farmers. Refugees who had lost everything became soldiers. Communities that had been separated for millennia suddenly found themselves speaking the same ancient language, singing the same ancient songs, defending the same ancient promises. The bones had come together. From the death camps of Europe to the deserts of the Middle East, from the ghettos of Russia to the mountains of Ethiopia, the scattered pieces of a people began their supernatural reassembly. Not by human organization, by divine orchestration. But here's what shakes me when I read Ezekiel 37. The prophecy isn't finished. Yes, the bones connected. Yes, sinews covered them. Yes, flesh clothed them. But when Ezekiel looked at this miraculous army, he saw something missing. They were complete, but they weren't alive. The breath of Ruach hadn't entered them yet. Israel today is militarily powerful, technologically advanced, economically robust. But spiritually, Romans 11 tells us they remain largely blind to their Messiah. The body has returned to the land, but the breath of God recognition of Yeshua, Jesus, has not yet filled the lungs of the nation. The prophecy waits for its final fulfillment. What if you're witnessing the middle of a miracle, not the end of one? What if the scattered bones of Israel coming together in 1948 was just the first movement in a symphony that won't conclude until every Jewish heart cries out, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord"? Because Ezekiel didn't just see resurrection, he saw recognition. He didn't just see a nation reborn, he saw a people renewed. The same prophet who watched bones become bodies also saw a day when those bodies would be filled with the very spirit of the one they had pierced. That day hasn't come yet, but it's written, it's promised, it's prophesied. And until it arrives, we stand in the valley with Ezekiel, watching the impossible unfold in stages, marveling at bones that remember their place, waiting for breath that will transform a body into a bride. The Hebrew word for hope is tikva. It's also the name of Israel's national anthem. Hope. Not optimism, not wishful thinking, but the deep, unshakable conviction that what God has spoken will come to pass. The bones have rattled, the nation has risen, but the scroll burns on, awaiting the moment when resurrection becomes revival, when return becomes recognition, when Israel says what they've been destined to say since the first prophecy echoed in Eden. The Lord, He is God. But as the bones rose, another army was forming, not of life, but of defiance. He rises from the north, dragging nations like chains, and Persia is among them. There are visions that shake prophets to their core, visions so dark, so final, that even the messenger trembles as he speaks them. And in the latter chapters of Ezekiel, we encounter one such prophesia, vision of war so vast, so terrible, that it makes every conflict before it seem like a skirmish between children. The prophet sees him clearly. Gog of the land of Magog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal, a figure whose very name feels like thunder, rolling across distant mountains. He is not just a king, he is a force, a spiritual principality clothed in flesh, gathering the nations like a shepherd gathers wolves for slaughter. And there, in the sacred text, written in the blood-red ink of divine warning, we find her name again, Persia. The same empire that once freed the captives now marches to destroy them. The hands that rebuilt Jerusalem's walls now reach to tear them down. The voice that once proclaimed liberty to the exiles now whispers death to their children. Persia, Ethiopia, and Libya will be with them, all of them with shield and helmet. Ezekiel 38-5. Ancient names for modern nations. Ethiopia, the Horn of Africa. Libya, North Africa's coast. And Persia, Iran, a coalition of the willing, united not by ideology but by hatred, not by strategy but by an ancient spiritual rebellion that runs deeper than oil, older than empires, more enduring than nuclear ambitions. But who is this Gog? Scholars have debated for centuries. Some see Russia and the northern tribes. Others point to Turkey, to Central Asia, to powers yet unborn. But perhaps we're asking the wrong question. Perhaps Gog is not just a man but a moment, the final expression of human pride, the last great rebellion against the throne of heaven, the culmination of every empire that has ever raised its fist against the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. What haunts the soul is this: Persia comes willingly. She is not dragged into this war's marches. The nation that once carried the key to Jerusalem's restoration now carries the sword of her destruction. How does a vessel of mercy become an instrument of wrath? How does a nation, once blessed, become a curse upon itself? The answer lies in the human heart, in the slow drift from gratitude to pride, from submission to rebellion. Persia forgot the God who raised her up. She exchanged the memory of Cyrus for the madness of conquest. She traded the humility that built temples for the arrogance that seeks to tear them down. But in Ezekiel's vision, something extraordinary happens. As Gog's hordes descend upon Israel like a storm cloud covering the land, as the coalition tightens its grip and the world holds its breath, God moves, not with diplomacy, not with sanctions or summits or strongly worded resolutions. He moves with the fury of divine justice, with earthquakes that split mountains, with fire that falls from heaven, with hailstones the size of boulders crushing the armies of rebellion. And I will call for a sword against Gog throughout all my mountains, says the Lord God. Every man's sword will be against his brother. And I will bring him to judgment with pestilence and bloodshed. I will rain down on him, on his troops, and on the many peoples who are with him, flooding rain, great hailstones, fire, and brimstone. Ezekiel 38:21. This is not warfare as we know it. This is divine intervention on a scale that makes the plagues of Egypt seem gentle. This is the moment when heaven's patience runs out, when the God who has endured mockery and rebellion and threats against his chosen people finally says, enough. And Persia, proud Persia, ancient Persia, nuclear Persia, finds herself not conquering, but conquered, not victorious, but obliterated, not feared, but forgotten. Because in the end, every nation that lifts its hand against Israel lifts its hand against the God who made a covenant with Abraham under the stars. You see, the war of Gog and Magog is not really about territory. It's not about resources or religion or regional dominance. It's theological. It's about whether man will bow to his maker, or whether he will continue to believe the lie whispered in Eden, "You shall be as gods." Gog represents the final flowering of human arrogance, the last great attempt to build a tower high enough to reach heaven's throne, and like every tower before it, this one too will fall. Not because Israel is strong, but because her God is faithful. Not because her weapons are superior, but because her covenant is eternal. What should shake us to our core is how precisely this ancient prophecy aligns with today's geopolitical reality. Iran's theocratic leadership speaks openly of Israel's destruction. Russia extends its influence southward. Coalitions form and dissolve and reform like shifting sands. The pieces move across the board exactly as Ezekiel foresaw, as if an invisible hand is guiding every decision, every alliance, every declaration of war. But here's the mystery that keeps prophetic scholars awake at night. When the vision is clear, but the timing remains hidden in the councils of eternity. Are we watching the stage being set? Are the actors taking their positions? Or are we still generations away from the final act? What we know is this: God's timetable is not man's timetable. His delays are not denials. His patience is not weakness. And when the moment comes, when Gog finally rises, when Persia finally marches, when the coalition finally strikes the world, we'll discover that the God of Israel is not sleeping. They will learn that covenants made under stars endure longer than empires built on sand. They will discover that the one who parted seas and toppled walls and raised the dead can still shake the earth when his people are threatened. And in that moment of divine fury, every tongue will confess what Ezekiel saw in his vision. Thus, I will magnify myself and sanctify myself, and I will be known in the eyes of many nations. Then they shall know that I am the Lord. Ezekiel 38-23. The war of Gog and Magog is not just prophesy, it's a promise. A promise that evil will not triumph, that rebellions will not succeed, that every coalition formed against the covenant will crumble like dust in the wind. What happens when a nation once used by God turns against him? It discovers that mercy rejected becomes judgment inevitable. It learns that the hand that once lifted up can also strike down. It finds that the God who makes nations can also break them, and that his tolerance, though long, is not limitless. And yet, even fire cannot erase a name God still whispers. I will break the bow of Elam, but I will restore her in the last days. There are prophecies that whisper. And then there are prophecies that thunder across the centuries like the voice of God himself splitting mountains in two. What you're about to hear is both. A divine paradox so staggering, so impossible, that it defies every human understanding of justice and mercy. Because buried in the scrolls of Jeremiah, chapter 49, lies a prophecy about ancient Elam, modern-day Iran, that speaks not just of judgment, but of something far more mysterious: restoration. Listen to the words that fell from heaven through the prophet's trembling lips. I will break the bow of Elam, the mainstay of their might. I will bring upon Elam the four winds from the four quarters of heaven. I will scatter them toward all those winds, and there shall be no nation where the outcasts of Elam shall not come. The bow of Elam, the very symbol of their military strength, their pride, their ability to strike down their enemies from a distance. God declares he will shatter it like pottery thrown against stone. For centuries, this seemed like ancient history. Elam, that powerful kingdom in what is now southwestern Iran, did indeed fall. The Persians conquered them, the Greeks swept through, the Arabs transformed them, the Mongols devastated them. And in our modern age, Iran's military might has been broken again and again by sanctions, by isolation, by the weight of international pressure. The bow has been breaking for millennia. But then comes the verse that stops scholars in their tracks, that makes theologians weep, that transforms everything we thought we knew about divine judgment. Yet it shall come to pass in the latter days that I will bring back the captives of Elam, says the Lord. Did you hear that? In the latter days. Not immediately. Not soon. But in the final chapter of human history, when the scrolls of time are nearly spent, God will restore Elam. Not just politically, not just geographically, but spiritually. The same soil that was cursed will become consecrated. The same people who were scattered will be gathered. The same nation that was judged will be justified. What kind of God does this? What kind of divine heart breaks a nation's strength only to rebuild it stronger? What kind of cosmic plan sees beyond rebellion to redemption, beyond wrath to restoration? Only the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Only the God who disciplines those he loves. Only the God who never writes the end where he is only meant to write to be continued. But here's where the prophecy becomes almost unbearable in its beauty, because we are living in those latter days. We are walking through the very season Jeremiah saw in his visions. And what do we witness in Iran today? Not just the continuation of judgment, but the first whispers of restoration. Beneath the surface of a regime that rails against Israel, beneath the rhetoric of annihilation and the pursuit of nuclear weapons, something else is stirring. Something the Ayatollahs cannot control and the mullahs cannot silence. The underground church in Iran is exploding. Former Muslims are seeing Jesus in dreams so vivid, so real, that they risk everything to follow him. House churches multiply in secret. Bibles are smuggled in backpacks and hidden in walls. Young Iranians, hungry for truth, are turning away from the emptiness of political Islam and discovering the fullness of Christ. The same people once scattered to the four winds are being gathered again not by human hands, but by the Spirit of the living God. This is the prophecy beneath the ashes. This is the hope hidden in the rubble of judgment. God did not speak destruction over Elam because he hated her people. He spoke it because he loved them too much to leave them in their rebellion. He broke their bow not to leave them defenseless, but to make them dependent. He scattered them not to abandon them, but to plant seeds of revival in every nation where they landed. Do you see the pattern? Do you feel the trembling in your spirit as the ancient words come alive in our headlines? Iran stands today at the crossroads of prophecy. On one path lies continued defiance, nuclear ambition, and the coalition of Gog and Magog that Ezekiel saw marching against Israel. On the other path lies repentance, revival, and a restoration so complete that former enemies become family in the kingdom of God. The bow is still breaking, the sanctions tighten, the isolation deepens, the regime grows more desperate. But beneath the surface, beneath the politics and the posturing, beneath the threats and the terror, the Spirit of God is moving like fire through dry grass. The same wind that scattered Elam to the four corners of the earth is now breathing life into dead bones, hope into hopeless hearts, and light into the deepest darkness. Could it be that what we're witnessing in Iran today is not just the fulfillment of Ezekiel's war prophecy, but the beginning of Jeremiah's restoration promise? Could it be that the soil of judgment is indeed becoming the ground of awakening? Could it be that the very nation prophesied to march against Israel in the end times is also prophesied to find mercy in those same end times? This is the mystery that makes angels lean forward in heaven. This is the paradox that proves God's ways are higher than our ways. This is the hope that refuses to die even in the darkest of nations. Because even while Persia's bow breaks, the Spirit begins to whisper underground. While the Ayatollahs rage, the Spirit moves in silence, house to house. In the darkness of Tehran, behind closed doors and drawn curtains, something ancient is stirring. Not in the halls of power, not in the rhetoric of revolution, but in the quiet corners where whispered prayers rise like incense through concrete walls. Iran, the same soil that once defied heaven, the same nation that builds weapons to destroy Israel, has become the stage for one of the most stunning spiritual awakenings in modern history. You won't read this in the headlines. The mullahs don't announce it. The state-controlled media buries it. But beneath the veil of Islamic theocracy, beneath the chants of death to America and death to Israel, something is happening that would make the ancient prophets weep with joy. The underground church in Iran is exploding. Listen to this carefully. Iran, modern-day Persia, the nation named in Ezekiel's end times coalition, the country racing toward nuclear capability while promising Israel's annihilation. This same Iran has become home to one of the fastest-growing Christian movements on earth. Former Muslims, raised to hate the name of Jesus, are encountering him in dreams so vivid, so undeniable, that they abandon everything to follow him. They risk imprisonment, they risk torture, they risk death, and still, they come. Do you see the divine irony? Do you see the fingerprints of God written across this seeming contradiction? The same Persian soil that once birthed Cyrus the Great, the same mountains where Daniel prayed and angels warred, the same valleys where Esther interceded for her people. This land is awakening again. But this time, not to build temples of stone, but to become living stones in the temple of the Most High. It started quietly, almost invisibly. In the 1980s, during the Iran-Iraq War, when the Islamic Revolution was still fresh and fierce, a few scattered believers began to gather. House churches, they called them, though they were often just living rooms where 2 or 3 would huddle around, smuggled Bibles, reading by candlelight, whispering the name of Jesus like a dangerous secret. The government cracked down, pastors were arrested, converts were executed, and still the fire spread. By the 1990s, the whispers had become a roar that only heaven could hear. Persian language Bibles, once rarer than gold, began flowing through underground networks. Satellite television broadcasts beamed the gospel directly into Iranian homes, bypassing every censor, every firewall, every Ayatollah's decree, and then came the dreams. Oh, the dreams. In a culture steeped in mysticism, where visions and revelations hold deep meaning, Jesus began appearing to Muslims across Iran. Not in churches there were few to be found, not through evangelists they couldn't enter the country, but in the midnight hours, in the sacred space of sleep, the Son of God walked into the hearts of his enemies and made them his friends. A young revolutionary guard, trained to crush dissent, dreams of a man in white who calls him by name and says, "Follow me." He wakes trembling, searches for answers, and within months is baptized in secret. A devout Muslim woman, draped in black, dreams of Jesus standing at her door, offering living water. She opens that door in her heart and never looks back. A university student, raised on propaganda against the great Satan, encounters Christ in a vision so powerful that he begins translating Christian literature, knowing it could cost him his life. The numbers are staggering, though impossible to verify completely. Conservative estimates suggest that between 300,000 to 1 million Iranians have converted to Christianity since 1979. More bold calculations whisper of numbers even higher. In a nation of 85 million, where conversion from Islam is punishable by death, where house churches meet in constant fear of discovery, the body of Christ is growing faster than the government can arrest its members. But here's what will shake you to your core. This isn't random. This isn't coincidence. This is prophecy fulfilling itself in real time, right before our eyes. Remember what Isaiah wrote about Egypt and Assyria territories that included much of modern-day Iran being blessed alongside Israel in the end times? Blessed be Egypt, my people, and Assyria the work of my hands, and Israel my inheritance. Could it be that the same God who once used Persia to rebuild Jerusalem's temple is now using persecution to build his eternal temple, stone by living stone? Think about the breathtaking irony of what God is doing. The regime that chants death to Israel is watching its own children fall in love with Israel's Messiah. The nation that funds Hamas and Hezbollah is becoming home to believers who pray for the peace of Jerusalem. The government that builds centrifuges to enrich uranium is watching souls enriched by the Spirit of the living God. This is not politics. This is the mystery of divine election playing out on the stage of history. The persecution is real and brutal. Pastor Youssef Nadarkhani spent years in prison for refusing to recant his faith. Saeed Abedini was tortured for leading house churches. Countless believers whose names we'll never know have paid the ultimate price. Yet for every Christian silenced, 3 more seem to emerge from the shadows. The blood of the martyrs, as Tertullian wrote, has become the seed of the church. And the spiritual hunger is unlike anything missionaries have seen elsewhere. These aren't nominal conversions or cultural shifts. These are Damascus Road experiences, Paul-like transformations that turn persecutors into preachers overnight. When someone in Iran decides to follow Jesus, they know exactly what they're choosing: exile from family, loss of employment, constant danger, possible death. Yet they choose him anyway, because when the Spirit of God moves, no earthly power can resist. What's happening in Iran today is a preview of something much larger, something the ancient prophets saw but couldn't fully understand. Jeremiah spoke of Elam, ancient southwestern Iran, being scattered to the 4 winds, but then promised that in the latter days, God would restore Elam's fortunes. Could this spiritual awakening be the beginning of that restoration? Not political restoration, but something far more valuable: souls returning to their Creator? The underground church in Iran prays for Israel. Let that sink in. While their government builds missiles to destroy the Jewish state, Iranian Christians gather in secret to intercede for the peace of Jerusalem. They understand, in ways their rulers cannot, that their spiritual father Abraham loved both Isaac and Ishmael, and that God's heart breaks for both the seed of promise and the children of exile. And so the scroll closes, but not on the story, only on the chapter we have been privileged to witness. From the dust of Eden to the headlines of today, we have traced a thread so golden, so divinely woven, that human hands could never have spun it. We have watched Persia rise from the genealogies of Noah, emerge from the shadows of Babylon, and step onto the stage of prophecy with a role so complex, so paradoxical, that only the mind of God could have authored it. Consider the breathtaking arc. In Genesis, she was named among the nations before nations existed. In the courts of Babylon, she became the hammer that shattered Israel's oppressor. Through Cyrus, she funded the rebuilding of God's temple. Through Esther, she became the unlikely sanctuary where genocide turned to deliverance. Through the Magi, she bowed at the feet of the newborn king. And in Ezekiel's vision, she stands among the armies that will one day test the patience of heaven itself. 4,000 years of divine choreography, 4 millennia of mercy and judgment, rebellion and redemption, dancing together in a pattern so intricate that we are only now beginning to see its design. But here's the question that should haunt your quiet hours. What if we are not watching the end of Persia's story, but standing at the threshold of its greatest chapter? What if the underground revival burning through Iran today is not coincidence, but prophecy? What if the same God who once breathed through Cyrus to restore Jerusalem's stones is now breathing through Persian believers to build living stones in his eternal temple? Could it be that the nation destined to march with Gog is also destined to kneel with the redeemed? Could it be that the soil soaked with the tears of martyrs will one day bloom with the fruit of revival? Could it be that the fire meant to consume will become the flame that illuminates? We live in the space between the lightning and the thunder, between prophecy spoken and prophecy fulfilled, between the vision given and the vision realized. The dry bones have rattled together. Israel stands again. The nations are aligning. Ancient hatreds are awakening, but so is ancient hope. In the secret rooms of Tehran, believers whisper prayers for Jerusalem. In the mountains of Iran, former enemies of Christ have become his most passionate followers. In the land that builds weapons of destruction, God is building weapons of worship. The irony is so profound, so divinely orchestrated, that it can only be the fingerprint of the Almighty. You who have watched this unfold, you who have traced these connections, you who have felt the tremor of recognition in your spirit, you are not merely observers, you are witnesses, not just to history, but to his story, not just to the rise and fall of nations, but to the rise and reign of the kingdom that will have no end. The world watches Iran and sees missiles. God watches Iran and sees harvest. The headlines scream of nuclear threats. Heaven whispers of spiritual breakthrough. The experts analyze centrifuges. The Spirit counts conversions. This is the hour for watchers, not sleepers. For intercessors, not spectators. For those who understand that behind every political alliance, every military maneuver, every diplomatic crisis, there is a deeper drama unfolding. The drama of souls, the drama of covenant, the drama of a God who will not let his promises fall to the ground. Ezekiel saw armies gather, but he also saw glory return. He witnessed invasion planned, but he also watched intercession prevail. He prophesied judgment coming, but he proclaimed restoration following. The trumpets are tuning, the scrolls are unrolling, the stage is set, and somewhere between the palace of Cyrus and the bunkers of today, between the gallows of Haman and the underground churches of Iran, between the vision of Gog and the promise of glory, we stand, not knowing the day or the hour, but knowing the author, not seeing the full picture, but trusting the painter, not understanding every mystery, but believing in the one who holds them all. The curtain has not fallen, the story has not ended, and Persia ancient, prophetic, mysterious Persia may yet surprise us all, because in God's hand, even ashes can become altars, even enemies can become evangelists, even the darkest prophecies can give birth to the brightest dawns. And Iran's flame may rise again this time, not in war, but in worship.